Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in. Hey, I've had a lot of people who have reached out to me wanting to know about what components were used to put this Honda K24 engine into my Vanagon, and that's what this video is going to be about. It's a little bit of a high level approach to what components were used and some of the places that I sourced them from, and won't get too detailed into cost because this is second quarter of 2025. There's a lot of upheaval right now as far as supply chain and tariffs and things like that. So wherever and whenever you are watching this, prices and availability may have changed. But anyway, let's go ahead. Let's get started. Let's talk about the main event here, and that is the engine itself. I sourced this from a junkyard about 40-50 miles away. It came out of a 2003 Honda Accord DX, which makes it a Honda K24 A4. And the junkyard pulled the engine for me and put it in the back of the pickup. I thought that was a really good deal. The engine ran. The engine had 129,000 miles on it. I made the decision to go ahead and do a timing chain service on it. Bought all new Honda OEM components, which included the chain, the tensioner, and the guides. And those parts were not cheap, but I felt it was money well spent to kind of push along the longevity of the engine, if at all possible. Engine adapter. I bought the engine adapter kit that mates the engine to the transaxle from Kennedy Engineering. This included the adapter plate, the flex plate for the torque converter, since this is an automatic van, and all the hardware. They've got them for manual transaxles as well. Really enjoyed working with them. That was a great experience, and it went together really well. This whole conversion would not have happened if it wasn't for Samba member PC Hill 2, and I want to give a special shout out to him because he's the one that prototyped this conversion in his Synchro van. I saw it in person and got to ride along. I made the decision that is the kind of conversion that I want for my van, and he's the one who fabricated the prototype of the engine mount system and supplied a couple of components for the exhaust, and it's a really great quality kit. It was a prototype, so there was a bit of a learning curve for both of us with this, but it was a really great kit. He offered a really good experience with it. Helped a lot in figuring out and problem solving and troubleshooting some things. If you're interested in doing one of these conversions, reach out to him via private message on the Samba. Give him some time. He's got a couple of irons in the fire, but reach out to him. Let him know whether or not you're using a K24A or a K24Z, because there are some differences there with the parts that he provides that he needs to know ahead of time. So do that. All right. You can see the valve cover there. That comes from Skunk 2. It is a magnesium valve cover. It's short. So that keeps the engine deck lid at the original height. I didn't have to cut it, cut into it very much. I didn't have to lift the deck lid, so everything pretty much stays in. I did have to take off the old insulation, which was looking pretty ratty anyway, and make a couple of trims with a Dremel tool on some of the ribs underneath it so that it would clearance it. Probably wouldn't have had to do that though if I had done something ahead of time, and that was on the transaxle mount, the center mount that goes onto the frame of the van. If I had put about a 1/2 inch spacer, an aluminum spacer or something like that underneath it to make the engine a little more even rather than kind of kicking up like this toward the firewall, I probably wouldn't have had to make those changes, but I did. I didn't want to go back and make a plate basically to put on that transaxle. So that's the way it is. With that valve cover, I had it Cerakoted, which is a pretty good kind of coating for this. Since it's magnesium, I wanted to keep that material protected. It's been over a year now. The finish of it is looking really well. In fact, I had the guy that did it come over here and take a look at it, and he was pretty impressed by how it's holding up so far. Let's talk about the intake system. I'm using an RBC Honda OEM style intake manifold, the RAA style. It just didn't work for this particular van because it kicked the throttle body in kind of an odd position, really too close to the firewall. So RBC intake, I'm using a Skunk 2, no, take that back, I'm using a K-tuned 70mm throttle body that is cable actuated. As far as the accelerator cable, I'm using Van Cafe's Subaru conversion automatic cable kit. It's a good kit. The throttle cable for this application is a little bit too long, and I've got it kind of configured in such a way behind the firewall. It works. I might sometime in the future go ahead and take that cable off and have it shortened, or go ahead and have another cable made. But the bracket and the cable itself are good quality. I'm using the original style map sensor. I'm using the original style idle air control module. I'm using an Acuity throttle position sensor. I am using a Cobra head style rubber intake boot because, again, it was pretty close from the throttle body to the firewall, and I was pretty adamant I did not want to make a cut into the firewall. And then I've got the intake going in toward the back and an air filter inside of the D pillar here. I did make one mistake when I first put this together, and that was that on one of the 90-degree elbows, and the parts that I use to make that intake are a series of 3-inch stainless steel or aluminum piping, along with silicone tubes and some Spectre 90-degree plastic parts. I had a plastic 90-degree elbow that I had fit the air intake sensor into. It was a little bit too close to the engine, so it picked up a lot of ambient heat and got heat soaked, and that caused some challenges with the fuel tables for the ECU and those kind of things. So I've since eliminated that part of it. I've moved the air sensor close to the air filter here in the D pillar, so that it's getting more realistic ambient air temperatures. And the filter itself is just a standard cone style air filter that you can pick up from pretty much any auto parts store around you. That's pretty much the intake side of it. The exhaust side of it, it's still using the original exhaust manifold. PC Hill 2 created a part in which the oxygen sensor screws into, and then it's using a Walker muffler that hangs off of the engine mount system. So that's the exhaust side of things. Let's talk about fuel system. I'm using the original style Bosch fuel pump and the metal canister fuel filter, using rubber lines coming into the engine bay. It's using a K-tuned fuel pressure regulator, as well as their fuel rail. I might not have had to have used the fuel rail. I might have gone with the original style fuel rail that came from Honda, but a lot of people that do K-tune swaps, they go with those fuel rails, and I was like, I'll go that route anyway. It wasn't an expensive part, but it might not have been completely necessary. Using original fuel injectors for the engine. So that was a little bit of a challenge because there's not a whole lot of data on those fuel injectors as far as like dead times and injector times and flow rates and stuff like that. So it took a little bit of fine tuning and trial and error getting that in the ECU programming the way that I felt like it worked out the best. But that's pretty much the fueling system. I'm using AN style push-on hose connectors. If I were to do it again, I would use all AN fittings using PTFE kind of AN hose. I think that would just look a little bit better. Doesn't necessarily make the functionality any different, but I do think that it would just make it look a little bit nicer. On the coolant system side, this van still had the original plastic radiator hoses going underneath the van, and I did not want to use them. In fact, when I started taking those off, the ends crumbled. So it was pretty much on its last legs anyway. I got stainless steel radiator pipes that go underneath the fan. I'm using, I think it's 5/8 inch heater hose for the heater circuits. As far as the coolant hoses from those radiator pipes to connect to the engine, I went to a couple of different auto parts stores and sourced various rubber hoses and cut them and then use splices. So that's very much a custom part of this particular build. With K24 conversions, you're more than likely going to see people using what's called an upper coolant manifold, and that sits on the back of the cylinder head. Those can be found through a number of different K-swap conversion parts suppliers, and you can go up pretty high in price or pretty. Don't buy the cheapest ones. I'll say that because they may not fit and finish, and you may have leaks and those kind of things. But this particular one, I think I got it from K-Tuned as well, or K-Series, one of those outfits there, and it was a pretty decent price. One thing that I will say about this, mine has a fill port on it. It's a 16AN fill port on it. I probably would have gone ahead and gotten the standpipe and the radiator cap so that it sits a little bit higher than anything else on the cooling system to kind of help bleed out air pockets and things, because that has been a little bit of a challenge. K24s, I think, are a little bit of a challenge anyway to get some air pockets out of it, but that's probably one thing that I would recommend doing, would be get the standpipe with the radiator fill cap on it, and that'll raise your coolant levels a little bit higher so that you can get those air pockets out. On the bottom half of it, I'm using a swivel type lower thermostat housing. The swiveling part of it worked out pretty well. That way I was able to get it to where it would line up with those custom made coolant hoses that I had to put together. If you go that route, go with one that has the OEM style thermostat control, or thermostat inside of it. Some of them don't. They have a different temperature rating on it, and that may affect the way that the engine runs, depending on what you're planning on doing with the engine. And that piece wasn't all that cheap. I think I spent probably close to $200 for that. And then you probably saw it in a couple of videos, but I had Fan Cafe's coolant pressure tank, the alloy type tank, for the water boxer, and I cleaned that up and repurposed it for this build. They have a bracket that fits the tank over here, over in that area, on that part of the fender. And then for a overflow bottle, I started looking at a couple of different components, and I settled on a Kubota diesel tractor radiator bottle. That works out really well for this particular build as an overflow, and it's held up pretty well. So that's pretty much the cooling system in the back of it. Now let's talk about one of the biggest problems to solve, and probably the most expensive part of a conversion like this, and that is the ECU, the engine management system, the wiring harness, and what goes on with that. I'm using a Haltech Elite 1500 ECU. I bought Haltech's premium Flying Leads wiring harness as the base of my wiring harness. There wasn't anybody out there that really made a harness for this kind of application. When I would approach different wiring harness providers, one of my key concerns and questions to them was, how long is the wiring harness? Because I wanted to keep the ECU in the same location as the OEM water boxer ECU, and I wanted to have a wiring harness that would go to all the components and not be too stressed and too stretched out. No one could give me an answer. So I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to spend, and plus, if I sourced one of those wiring harnesses by one of the K or one of the kind of conversion houses, you're probably looking at about $2,000 by the time you got everything, organized and how it was ordered. I'm like, no, 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 no. I'm going to make my own. Well, turns out buying the Flying Leads wiring harness, the connectors, the materials for like heat shrink, the tooling, some of the abrasive protectors and things like that, I have as much invested in that as I do in the entire ECU. So that's something that people don't really realize, is that there's not a cheap, you could probably go cheap in finding a wiring harness that might work, but I would really be concerned about what kind of quality and the reliability of it, to be quite frank about it. So I made my own wiring harness, bought the tooling. Every time that I made a crimp on a wire, I tested it with a multimeter from the connector at the ECU to that new connector to make sure I had continuity before moving on to anything else. That was a pretty steep learning curve, I have to admit, to learn how to do that wiring, because there's several different types of wiring and there's several different approaches on how you have to address those wires and those connectors and what they do. I'm using Haltech's wideband oxygen sensor controller, and I'm using Haltech's tachometer signal conditioner. With the water boxer, the tach signal comes off of the single ignition coil. It's on the negative post, and that's what feeds the tach signal. For the Honda K24, this is coil on plug. You lose that opportunity. So I had to get this tach signal converter. There's a wire that comes off of the ECU into that tach signal, and then, or into that converter, and then that converter routes a signal up to the gauge in the dash cluster. That's worked out pretty well. Every so often I'll have a little bit of a blip where the RPMs kind of drop off a little bit. I think it has more to do with that converter. I've looked at the stability of the RPMs on the laptop, as well as an application that I have here on my phone, and they've remained pretty stable. So I think it has more to do with that connector, but overall it's done pretty well. And building that harness, that was a pretty big deal. That took me a long time to get that figured out. Now, as far as the ECU, you have to have a base map that's loaded onto it, and then you start doing some fine tuning on it. I have yet to have the van on a dyno. I don't know what kind of horsepower, what kind of torque it's making at this moment, but I have gone through, when I'm driving, I take a data log on the laptop connected to the ECU. I look at what it's doing. I'm looking at fuel tables, I'm looking at spark tables, I'm looking at what the AFR is happening, in real time there in that data log, and making adjustments accordingly. And so far, that's worked out pretty well. I'm not making big changes to any of those metrics on there. I will say this though. One thing that really impacted the drivability, last year I did a shakedown run after putting this into the van for about 1,000 miles round trip. I had the decel cut for the throttle response off of the throttle position sensor, and it felt like somebody had a great big toggle switch just going on and off, on and off, on and off, and it made the driving experience just really jerky. I've since changed that from receiving a signal off of the throttle position sensor to the map sensor, and that smoothed this out a lot. Now I can get into the throttle with a whole lot more finesse, and when I come off of the throttle, then it kind of tapers off rather than having that hard drop off and that lurching forward of the whole van. So that made a big deal. But as far as learning how to program this, there's some really good resources out there. Haltech has some really great resources on the Elite 1500 paired with the Honda K24 engines. That was a resource that I visited many times. not just their videos, but their knowledge articles on their website. High Performance Academy, they were another one. Both Hall Tech and High Performance Academy helped me a lot when it came to learning about how to approach the wiring harness build. I used both of those resources. I watched their content quite a bit on figuring out how to do that. And another resource that I used was Evans Performance. Jeff Evans has a website out there in which he has courses for purchase where you can learn how to do ECU tuning and those kind of things. I signed up for his monthly course prescription. He's got several of them out there that are Hall Tech and Honda K24 specific, and that worked out great. I watched those many, many times. I'm still watching them today to try to learn a little bit more, to see, okay, am I on the right track, or is there something else? Oh, I missed that piece. Yeah, okay, well, let's add that to the equation of engine management tuning. But that's pretty much what was involved in there. Anytime that you're doing an engine conversion like this, and especially with it being kind of a prototype, which is how I figure this one is, there's always going to be parts and components that you buy in anticipation of I can use that, and then it comes to the application and it's like, nope, not going to be able to use that, not without modification, or that's just not going to work at all. There are other electric components I've added in breaker switches and additional wiring and things like that, you know, that most people don't probably think about when they're performing a conversion like this. This is using the Vanagon's 3-speed automatic, and I used a PowerFlex transmission mount bushing rather than the OEM style rubber bushing. That's worked out pretty well. I think it translates a little bit too much vibration into the van, so I might switch back over to the rubber style. Time will tell. I may keep this forever, who knows. But one thing that I did have to do and approach a problem with the water boxer and the automatic transaxle, there is that basically it's a heat exchanger, and it runs the engine coolant and the automatic transmission fluid through the same component. And you can do a couple of searches on there. There's been some folks where that component has failed internally and both fluids mix and compromise coolant and the ATF. And I didn't want to have that kind of problem. So I ditched that system and I went with a derail, I think it's a 13900 or 13990 automatic transmission cooler kit. It came with pretty much everything except for the fittings to go onto the transaxle. And I picked those up. They're banjo fittings with barb fittings on the other end. Picked them up off of eBay. And this particular transaxle, or the transmission cooler, it has a fan. It has a thermostat switch so that when the temperatures get to a certain level, that fan kicks on. So far that has worked out really well. Now it does add a little more volume to how much transmission fluid you have to use in it, but not by much. But that has been really well. It's getting to be warmer temperatures here, and there's times in which I hear that thing kick on and then it kicks off when it's supposed to, and that works out pretty well. Trying to think of anything else that might be of use to you. Power steering, let's talk about that. I'm using the OEM style power steering pump, and I sourced the power steering adapter that uses an AN style fitting, bolts to the top of that power steering pump. And I had to have a high pressure hydraulic line made by a company about 30 miles away from me. That was a little more of a challenge than I had anticipated it to be. It took about 4 attempts to make that hose and make that hose right to where it wouldn't leak. And that hose goes from that adapter It wasn't that the adapter side of it was leaking, it was where it was connecting to the hard line in the van, because what we found out is that that is a British pipe fitting, not an AN, not an SAE or a metric. It's a British pipe fitting, and thankfully they had one of those adapters sitting on the shelf, and when that was used, then the leaks went away. That power steering hose, though, it doesn't have a baffle to it, and that's one thing that I wish I could find somebody to make one, because it does add a good bit of noise to the cockpit. I can hear it when the engine's running, because those baffles inside those hoses, that OEM kind of components, it changes the pulse of the pump and that fluid pressure and all that kind of stuff, and so it quiets it down a little bit. That would be really good if I could have something like that. So I'm looking through a list here. I think I've pretty much gone through a high level of what I've used here. One project that is coming up, when I took the water boxer system out, I lost the air conditioning system. And that was one of the biggest, I wouldn't say regret, but sort of the things that I lost, that I hated to lose the most, because that system worked really well. It still held R12 refrigerant. It still worked really well, but there just was not a way to adapt that to the Honda K24. So now I've got a AC compressor. I got it remanufactured, sitting on a table out of camera shot. There are the new hoses, the new fittings, the new crimping tool, the new dryer, the condenser. I have to rebuild the entire air conditioning system, from the condenser, all of the lines, the dryer, fitting the lines over to the compressor. There's going to be some adapters for that compressor. I got those from Jack Spania Racing, and there's going to have to be some modifications to the electrical components in the Westy cabinet, where all those pressure sensors and things like that live, because what I want this to do is that when I hit the switch on the dash to turn the air conditioning on, I want to have the ECU triggered to where it will increase the RPMs to compensate for it, so it doesn't bog the engine down. So that's going to take a couple of modifications there, but I don't think it's going to be too big of a hassle. But that's coming up hopefully in the next month. And I apologize if my camera and all this is fading in and out and all that. My GoPro died. It ate up my batteries, and I tried an external power source on it, and it's locking up because of heat. I need to get another camera, but anyway, that's another issue. Let's talk about the experience of doing this conversion. I did this in my basement. I'm not an auto mechanic. I'm just a hobbyist, like many of you. And it was tough. I don't have a lift either. So I did this on the ground, and I'm not as svelte as I used to be in my younger days, but I did it. It took a lot of effort, but I was able to do it. Driving experience, oh my gosh, that has been the biggest positive takeaway. Because with the water boxer, there were so many times in which from start cycle to start cycle, I would get a different experience. It would either run great, it'd run poorly, it'd do something wacky or odd, and it knocked me out of a couple of different events and going on trips and things like that, and I didn't want that. Now with the Honda K24 conversion, I turn the ignition switch on, it fires right up, it goes through a consistent idle sequence to where it idles about 850, 900 RPM, and I go down the road. And wherever I'm going, when I get there, turn the key, it starts right up, I go on about my business. That has been a huge improvement over what the original water box. I'm not here to bash on the water boxer and all that kind of stuff. I'm just saying that the engine and its engine management system for this van was compromised. And for me to put that back to right would have taken having a rebuilt unit as far as the motor, and I would probably take out all of the Digifont wiring and ECU and things like that, and go with something like Marco Manci's EFI system. I think he's really producing something really great out there for the water boxers, and trying to keep momentum going for those original style engines. But for this, yeah, it wasn't going to work. and to kind of give you an idea, had I gone with a rebuilt, let's say a 2.2 or a 2.3 water boxer engine, I was still going to have to buy all brand new hoses. I was still going to have to buy an aftermarket transmission cooler, because I wanted to remove that coolant and ATF exchanger no matter what. I'd have to buy a brand new exhaust system. I would have to, and again, I would probably source Marco Manci's electronic fuel injection. When I started taking a look at and adding up all the cost of that, I was right in line with what it cost me to do the Honda K24. Now, granted, this cost me a good bit. I estimate, without factoring in the air conditioning component so far, about 10 grand. And people go, oh my gosh, 10 grand. Yeah, 10 grand. A third of that price, probably a little bit more, was in the engine management system and the wiring and those components. And I don't think people really factor that into some of these conversions. I didn't want to have old wiring. I didn't want to have old engine management computers, because there's a lot of things, those are old components. There's going to be failures with them. There's going to be issues. And I wanted everything to be brand new. If there was a failure, it was going to be on me, because something that I goofed up on a wiring harness or something like that. And so far, so good. But yeah, that's about where I stand as far as pricing. Getting back to the drivability. I just made a 1,000-mile round trip in this van. It did very well. I'm getting about 18, on average, 18 miles to the gallon, because it's a 3-speed automatic. If I had a freeway flyer, differential, and a couple of other things, I could probably get a little bit more out of it. But the driving experience, I felt very confident going where my destination was, driving around, coming back home. I drove home and had to sit in Atlanta rush hour traffic in a modern vehicle. That is a nerve-wracking experience. But I had the confidence in this thing that it made it through, and it did very well. And that, again, is one of the key improvements to doing this conversion for me personally, was having that confidence in that it's going to be reliable. But anyway, enough of me rambling on about all this different stuff. I really appreciate all of you. I know there's been several of you who have joined the channel recently. I really appreciate you, and those who have stayed the course and stayed subscribed. Thank you so much for being here. There may be a couple of other videos coming down the line. I may do a couple of things about the air conditioning system. I'm not going to get into a how-to video, but maybe some high-level stuff about where I sourced parts and some of the things that it took to put that system back on. I may do a couple of other drivability videos in the future, and you know, it's a Vanagon. There's always going to be something that needs to be done to it, or some improvements, or some ideas and things like that. So anyway, thank you for watching. If you like this, if you're not subscribed, please subscribe, like, share, subscribe. You know the drill on it. And again, thank you so much for watching.